Welcome one and all. We are looking at lesson 11 today, which is the access and consumption of sitcoms. So continuing with that overarching dot point there, specifically we're going to be looking at the ownership of the popular culture, so who owns sitcoms, and then the tensions that can be produced between consumers and producers. So make sure you highlight that and we'll make a start. Alrighty. So I've broken this up into two main categories. We can see the first part of the dot point is looking at the ownership of the popular culture, so looking at who owns it, and then the second half is looking at the tensions between consumers and producers. So when it comes to the ownership of sitcoms, there are two main, that's 4, 2 plus 2 is 4. There are two main owners of sitcoms. Now, the first and most predominant people who quite literally own it are producers. So producers such as Andy Samberg from Brooklyn Nine-Nine and Marta Kaufman from Friends are the two folks and there's lots of producers at different shows, but they're the guys that fund the sitcoms. So they have ultimate, power in the types of content that is put on sitcoms, because they're the ones funding and paying the actors, paying for the sets and the props. Just going to bold that. And they're the ones that are responsible for pitching it to networks to get a slot. So networks typically have authority. So networks, things like NBC, Warner Brothers, Fox, they're the people that put it live on TV. So Netflix would be a network now of sorts. So a lot of networks have different regulations that they require sitcoms to reach. So for example, if a producer of a sitcom like Andy Samberg wants to put his sitcom on a prime time slot, then the network's going to have restrictions on the types of language they can use, the types of content that it can feature, and things of that nature. So they're the two, well, they're one, there's technically three groups then. So you've got producers who kind of have your power over the ownership of it. You have your networks who have authority over when the show's put on and how it's put on and what avenues that's put on. And then the last kind of group that shows ownership of sitcoms are our consumers. Okay, so you guys, us. So to some extent, we take ownership of the sitcom as well, because if we look at especially and explicitly our contemporary values and how that reflects the content that is portrayed in sitcoms, if it's not aligning with consumers, then we're not going to view it. So we almost have some kind of ownership, because we're only going to watch things that we can relate to, find humorous, or can be entertained by. So if we're watching a sitcom we don't like what we see because it doesn't reflect our contemporary values or beliefs, then we are less likely to watch that and consume it. So we do have some ownership of it to some extent as well. Now the second part of this dot point, so that's sort of the ownership of it. The second part is the tensions that can be created between producers and consumers. So producers, as we know, are the guys that fund the show, and consumers are the people who consume the show. Now there are a few reasons that tension can be caused between the two, but above this word tension here, it all comes back down to, and draw a little arrow above here, a clash of beliefs and values. Okay, that's what all these tensions sort of boil down to. So I've done a dot point on each main area of contention. Most of them are relating to consumers putting pressure on producers, but there are some areas where producers put pressure on consumers. So the first one is obviously a lack of ethnic diversity. So tensions can be caused between producers and consumers because of that. Consumers may demand, as was the case in Friends, that there is better ethnic representation on the show. So if we look at Friends, Charlie Wheeler, this character to my right, was put in and written into season 4, I think, as Ross's love interest for that season, to have a reoccurring African-American character, because as we know, the cast of Friends are all white Caucasian people. So there was a very distinct lack of ethnic diversity there. If we look at the American population, there are a significant proportion that are African American, and the fact that there was no representation of any persons of color on that show was something that caused tensions between consumers and producers. So that's one example there. We also know that we can see that as in not necessarily a lack of ethnic diversity, but also improper representation of that ethnic diversity. Can you write like a little arrow here, plus, and then write Simpsons / Apu? So Apu in The Simpsons has that character's been taken out altogether due to consumer backlash about how that was an improper representation of that ethnicity. So that can cause tension between producers and consumers as well. Another point of tension is around our concept of gender and particularly how women are represented in sitcoms. So if we look at Big Bang Theory, for example, there's this dichotomy between the role that women play. So in order to be successful in a male-dominated industry, smart, the women have to typically appear to be less fashionable, less attractive, and fail in social relationships. Whereas if we look at the conditions for the opposite of that, according to the show, being attractive, being socially dominant, and desirable by men or women, that person has to meet certain social and societal expectations around gender. So as a result, Penny is not smart because she's attractive, or she's portrayed as attractive, whereas Amy here is portrayed as unattractive because she's smart. So you can't ever have the case where you can have both things, and that's how they're representing women in that show. Now that's very reflective of patriarchal values, and there's a lot of tension between producers and consumers around that point. So you see later on in later seasons that Penny starts to take more responsibility in her workplace, and receives some work promotions and engages in more meaningful work as opposed to just being a waitress at a restaurant. And you see the introduction of Bernadette, who is, I guess, trying to be typecast as both attractive and intelligent. So they're trying to break down that dichotomy. But it also plays in other sitcoms where you see of how women are represented. If you look at Friends, for example, that's another example. You could draw a line here, another arrow here, where Rachel and Monica are in very domesticated jobs. One's in the fashion industry, one's a cook or a chef. Monica loves to clean. Her passions revolve around those very maternal processes, whereas the guys of the show, particularly Ross and Chandler, have very white-collar jobs. They're very much the provider for the family. And so those tensions between gender can create backlash and conflict between consumers and producers, and that's why you see in more recent sitcoms such as Brooklyn Nine-Nine, there's greater gender diversity and representation in regards to equity and equality. Another thing that can cause tension is beliefs and values in general, but particularly around our micro-socialization agent of family. So some of the themes depicted in the sitcoms doesn't align with the belief or the common beliefs and values of family members watching it. So an example here is in earlier seasons of The Simpsons, Homer would routinely choke Bart, and it was a point of humorous content. Whereas the idea of what this is doing is making a joke out of and normalizing domestic violence, which of course is a very serious issue. So the idea that was being portrayed as something as funny created tension between producers and consumers to the point where in later seasons Homer stopped physically abusing his son. And I've written here that this can also extend to representations of same-sex couples in sitcoms. So if we look at Modern Family, the representation of Cam and Mitch, whilst it is positive that they have same-sex marriage couple, how they're represented as being over the top and overly flamboyant has created tensions with consumers regarding stereotyping. There's also the idea of over-sexualization of humour, in some sitcoms, such as The Big Bang Theory, where every punchline, or almost every punchline, is related and sexual in nature, has caused a lot of families to not watch those types of sitcoms because they either deem it inappropriate for their children or they find the humour crass. So that can create some tensions between producers and sitcoms as well. So they're the ones mainly that are consumer-led conflict, whereas if we look at something that's producer-led conflict, it's the issue of piracy. So because of the digital development of technology over time and online streaming, there's been a huge increase in piracy of sitcoms. So the tension here is that producers are obviously losing out money if you're watching their show for free. So the way they get money is you're either watching it via normal telly, and they get ad revenue from the TV ads in the breaks. You're paying for an online subscription, which is included in their costs, or you're paying for some kind of DVD box set merchandise. If you go on the internet and download it for free, they haven't made any money off your consumption, or have not had the opportunity to make money off your consumption. So that is a point of tension between producers and consumers, which is very much producer-led. Last but not least, now that we've tackled both sides of those dot points, there is a HSC question here I would love for you to tackle. So, examine how the relationship between producers and consumers creates tension in one popular culture. So we're very much focusing on this second half of the dot point, but I've put in the idea of the relationship between. Okay, so examine, we know, if we break that down, is an explain on steroids. So you're almost looking at something under the microscope there. So providing lots of detail in your peels. So when you do your example sentence, I'd probably be referring to more than one sitcom if you can, because you're examining it. Now we're looking at the relationship between, so how these two things interact. That's what that means. So how producers and consumers, so the relationship between producers and consumers, how that creates tension. Now again, we looked here that most of them are consumer-led and driven, but some are producer-led and driven as well. So I would probably do, if this was a 15 marker, you would probably do at least have one peel that's looking at that producer angle. But for a 5 marker where you are doing 2 peel paragraphs, you can pick any 2 examples you like. Remember, there's no need for an intro or conclusion in a 5 marker. You just get straight to it. Alrighty, that's it for lesson 11. Thank you. Oh, I pressed the wrong button. I think it's F10.